Thank you so much. Welcome to this panel. This panel is titled Indigenous Peoples and the Energy Transition, Supporting Strategies for Self-Determination in the Face of a New Wave of Extractivism. This panel is being organized by Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in a Green Economy, Search Coalition. Today we have with us our three panelists. I will introduce them. We have Galina Agarova to my left. She's the Executive Director of the Search Coalition. We also have Kate Finn. She's the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide and the Chair of the Executive Committee of the Search Coalition. And we also have the honor to have Payal Sampat, the Mining Program Director of Earthworks. Thank you so much. At COP28 last year, countries agreed to triple renewable energy capacity globally and accelerate the reduction of vehicle emissions through the development of infrastructure and rapid deployment of zero and low emission technologies. Consequently, we can expect an increase in mining for minerals needed for the transition as countries ramp up the deployment of renewable energy technologies and electric vehicles. A study published in Nature found that of 5,097 mining projects globally that involve about 30 minerals used in renewable energy technologies, 54% are located on or indigenous peoples' lands and territories. At the same time, in Africa, that number is as high as 75%. At the same time, indigenous peoples' lands span nearly 1/4 of the world's terrestrial surface and contains 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So how do we make sure that the proposed medicine doesn't also become poison? That's the question we are here to answer today. And we hope that during this conversation we can shed some light over what the problem is and what we can do together. All over the world, we are seeing an increasing mining for transition minerals. In Chile, for example, the second largest producer of lithium, mining activities impacting water systems, causing biodiversity loss and violating indigenous rights. In Argentina, many more projects to extract lithium have been proposed, and investment is flowing faster than regulations are being updated. In the United States, there is huge pressure to scale up copper, nickel, and lithium mining and to fast-track permits. In Indonesia, there is massive increase in proposed and active nickel mining projects as large US, European, and Asian car makers are signing contracts with Indonesian producers and governments. So as you can see, this is a very broad problem, but we have our experts here today who will be able to help us navigate this conversation. So I also like to let you know that we are gonna hear the presentations from our speakers today, and we'll have some time at the end for some questions. If you have any questions, please leave them for the end. So we'll begin with Payal from Earthworks. Please introduce yourself and Earthworks.
Hi, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with these esteemed speakers and colleagues and with this audience. I am, as Brian said, my name is Payal Sampat, and I'm the Mining Program Director at a nonprofit organization called Earthworks. We stand with indigenous communities on the front lines of extractive industries, oil, gas, and mining projects, and we advocate for systemic solutions that reduce the harm and uplift the rights of peoples on the front lines of those projects. Yes, Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. So as we start to navigate this conversation, I think one of the important questions is, in everyone's mind, what are transition minerals? Can you tell us what they are?
Well, very simply, these are the minerals that are used in technologies that are used in the energy transition. Basically, to build the renewable energy technologies, including electric vehicle batteries, storage batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, etc. And these are minerals that, many of them are minerals that we've been extracting for centuries, minerals like copper, minerals like nickel. And some of these are minerals that have not been previously extracted in large amounts, that are used almost exclusively in these technologies, such as lithium, for example, that are used in storage batteries for electric vehicles as well as for energy storage. And many people use the term critical minerals. And I'm here to tell you there's nothing critical about these minerals. These are minerals that, there's a list of 18 to 30 minerals that are used in many of these technologies, but critical minerals is a term that we are trying to encourage people to stop using because it is a Cold War terminology that is now being capitalized on by the mining industry to center the importance of these minerals.
Thank you so much. That's such a great explanation, right? And I think now the reason why we're having this conversation is because this is very important to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights all over the world. So maybe can you also tell our audience, what's the overlap? Why Indigenous peoples should be part of this conversation, and what's the overlap between where these minerals are being extracted and where Indigenous peoples' lands and territories are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said in your introduction, Brian, the overlap between Indigenous peoples' lands and territories and where mining companies are seeking to extract these minerals is tremendous. Globally, it is over 50% of the energy transition minerals are being prospected for, explored, or extracted on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples. And it is higher in some regions, as you mentioned, in Africa, in the United States, where between 2/3 and almost 100% of the extraction of transition minerals is on Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And in many of these places, in most of these places, unfortunately, Indigenous peoples' rights are being trampled. This is coming at the expense of Indigenous peoples' rights. In the United States, for example, there's a lot of fast tracking of these mineral projects that would shortcut processes that would require consultation, let alone free, prior, and informed consent. And so this is, given the overlap between Indigenous peoples' territories and these minerals that we collectively as a society have deemed are so essential for this energy transition, so essential for us to address this existential crisis of climate change. It really calls for a reckoning, and it calls for a moment in which Indigenous peoples' rights must be first and foremost upheld and centered before any of these mineral extraction projects go ahead. And within the Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy Coalition, that's really the focus of our work, and it's really an opportunity moment. It is an opportunity moment for Indigenous peoples, and we need to make sure that it is Indigenous peoples and not the corporations who are seeing this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Part of the experience we have, and we had the experience to attend COP28 last year in Dubai, and some of the things we heard when critical or transition minerals were being discussed in small rooms, in these spaces where a lot of decisions are being made. And you could hear often that they would refer to them as critical minerals. And so it's very important, as you said, to bring this into the debate and to analyze really what the situation is on the ground. So thank you so much for that. Now, along with this, we're also hearing a narrative that because they're so critical for the deployment of renewable energies, for the deployment of wind farms and solar panels and electric vehicles, because there is this narrative that there's such an urgency for this shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. So as they're trying to fast track in governments and companies, we're hearing that they are critical and that we should mine them as fast as possible. And that demand then, it's increasing. So if the answer is not we should increase the demand to be able to deploy all these technologies, then what is the answer? How can we meet that need to really shift into renewable energy sources without causing much harm?
Thanks, Brian. I think that is really the crux of this whole discussion. We know we need to urgently address this crisis of climate change. And we also know that we cannot do so at the cost of Indigenous peoples' rights, lands, and livelihoods, and health. And I think the good news is that there is a way that we can obtain the benefits of these minerals without having to dig huge holes in the ground that cause long-term harm and short-term land grabs of Indigenous peoples' territories. We have the University of Technology in Sydney conducted an extensive scenario-based study 2 years ago in which they found that up to 55% of the minerals that we need for these renewable energy technologies, even under the most ambitious scenarios in which we are 100% renewable by 2040, up to 55% could be met through secondary sources, meaning recycling, recirculation, as well as demand reduction. Now, one of the issues is that a lot of the policies in countries like Canada and the US are really in favor of new extraction, and the playing field is tilted away from recycling. So there aren't a lot of policies on the books that would really spur that kind of end-of-life capture of the minerals from solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, everyday e-waste products. Now, we have to make sure that when there is recycling and when those materials are captured, that is done so with the highest human rights and environmental and labor standards, because recycling has its own costs. But it's just really important to keep in mind that there are ways to meet this demand. A second really important thing to keep in mind is that battery chemistries are changing so rapidly, and that where right now a lot of mining companies are seeing the opportunity to fast track mining in order to, under the guise of critical minerals, transition minerals, we may see chemistries and technologies for batteries 5, 6, 7 years down the line that don't rely on these minerals, that are use far less quantities of those minerals. And the third shift really is in terms of demand. Are we talking about more private electric vehicles for people in California and Geneva, or are we thinking about ways in which to provide mobility without the same amount of materials? And so there's some studies that have shown that we may actually need only a fraction of the lithium that's being projected. We can see a 93% reduction in lithium demand if we really had better combination of recycling policies and public transportation options, as well as smaller battery size. So we don't need to have these huge SUV batteries. If we have smaller battery size, that also can reduce the impact on communities who are bearing the brunt of these new mining proposals.
Thank you. And that is so important. And thank you so much for the research that Earthworks is doing, because I think part of our job in these spaces is to come and challenge those harmful narratives that are out there, that this should be done fast and that we need to meet the demand at all cost. And That's not true. We
Right.
can, there are other alternatives that we can still deploy while at the same time upholding the rights of indigenous peoples. And this is part of the conversation out there. And it's, a lot of our indigenous brothers and sisters are also bringing this to the discussions. So for everyone to listen. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us in that great introduction, Pyle. We'll now go to Galina Angarova, the Executive Director of the Search Coalition. Thank you so much for being with us. And could you please introduce yourself and the Search Coalition?
Yes. Sabina Khondutoni Khudut. My name is Galina Angarova. I can hear some noise. Maybe.
Just too close.
Yes, yeah. And I come from the Abzai clan of the Hirit Nation of the Buryat peoples in Siberia. I currently live and work in the United States, in the city of Portland, the City Territories of the Multnomah people. I first want to say, send my gratitude to the team of Cultural Survival that are hosting the Indigenous Media Zone here at the United Nations, for a lot of Indigenous leaders who come here all the way from their traditional territories. They are waiting in line to register their statements, and sometimes there is not enough even time for them to air their 1 or 2 minute statements. And this is an opportunity for these leaders to come here and find that alternative space to be heard and to air their statements here. So thank you so much. Search Coalition. We started informally about 4 years ago. As a response to a tragedy that happened in the Russian Arctic in 2020, when 21,000 tons of diesels were spilled into a local river on Taimyr Peninsula and impacted the lands of indigenous peoples, impacted the subsistence resources to indigenous peoples. And since then, we've organized as different organizations, 5 organizations. It's Cultural Survival, First Peoples Worldwide, Batani Foundation, Earthworks, and Society for Threatened Peoples. And about a month ago, we welcomed an affiliate member, International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs. And since 4 years ago, we've started strategizing, spent thousands of hours of strategy and trust and relationship building, but also encountering a lot of cases of abuse of human rights and indigenous people's rights globally as we're entering the so-called energy transition or digital transition, where vast amounts of resources like copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium is being sought around the world. And about 2 years ago, when the new research and study by the University of Queensland came out and gave us the real data that more than 54% of all transition minerals are located on the lands of indigenous peoples. And then I think there will be some more data coming online with rare earth minerals as well. And that number will climb. I think that we thought that it's our duty, it's our responsibility as organizations, indigenous and allied organizations, to really stand up and make, this a priority for us, because this is the next wave, and I really hope it's not the next wave of colonization. That's why we organized ourselves, because we believe in collective work, in horizontal work, as different organizations coming together and putting all of our strengths, different strengths, like legal strengths, technical strengths, knowledge about mining, indigenous peoples, connections to communities, and so on. Because as a collective, we can do so much more than we're working individually.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So maybe we can, you've described what the coalition is, and for our public, it would be good to know how is the Search Coalition supporting the communities who are being threatened or are currently experiencing extraction of transition minerals. And what is also the coalition doing to uplift Indigenous peoples' self-determination as part of their work?
Great. Thank you for the great question. And as 6 organizations, as I mentioned, we all have our own strengths, and we approach to support communities in different ways. First and foremost is the joint advocacy. We hear the stories of Indigenous leaders and communities affected by such imposition and a violation of their rights. So we are here to support through joint advocacy. We support with travel grants, coming here to the United Nations, bringing leaders so that they themselves can talk directly to the governments, to their governments, to other Indigenous leaders, and strategize with other leaders to come up with the campaigns. Then the second approach is through financial support. We cannot get, of course, we need, some communities do need financial support, and that's done through Cultural Survival, the Keepers of the Earth Fund. We support communities through small grants, where the communities for themselves decide what their self-determined priorities are in terms of their response to this encroachment. It could be developing their own FPIC protocols, engaging in FPIC protocols. It could be a communications campaign, but the communities have to decide for themselves. Then we also support community members coming with us in different spaces like the EU Parliament. For about 3 years now, we have been engaging in different processes and legislative processes at the EU level. For example, we engaged in the drafting of the EU battery regulation, corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and critical raw materials act. And we are very proud to be finally kind of moving into codification of free, prior, informed consent, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and references to Indigenous peoples for the first time maybe in history in the legislation that is being released by the European Union. So we've made some visits to EU, met with the parliamentarians, with council members, with commission members to really advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples, and it seems like this legal regime is getting more and more partial to Indigenous peoples, but they need more education, of course. And that's what we're here for, to work together with the people who are affected by these issues, coming together and advocating with the people, with the decision makers in different political, different legal regimes. And of course, we're working in solidarity, building that solidarity with us, among different communities. So it's always been like this for Indigenous peoples. The only reason why the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples became a reality is because Indigenous peoples have always worked in solidarity with each other. You know, that became a reality. And we hope that other political documents, very important documents, become a reality because we are continuing being in solidarity with each other and supportive of each other's efforts. So maybe this is a brief response.
Thank you so much for sharing about the excellent work that the coalition is doing. And I guess in short, we can say there's so much we can do to support communities, so much, whether it is through advocacy, through financial support, through uplifting their stories, through the various ways that we can do this in communications, because Indigenous peoples have a lot to say. Yeah.
I forgot to add the communications part. We have our website, but we also have outlets of all 5 organizations, now 6 organizations, where we constantly publish material, new material that's coming online, because there's just so much happening in the world at the moment. There's so many case studies that are becoming known, And we want these case studies to be known to the rest of the world, like this is what's happening. This is the human right violation is happening. This person was subjected to harassment and things like that. So we would like that information to be available through as many channels as possible. We were able to secure many interviews with multiple mainstream media outlets like NPR, Guardian, Grist, Politico, and many other publications. So this issue is becoming mainstream, and it's on the radar of many policymakers as well as the general public.
Thank you so much, Galina. And I think it's a great segue to our next my next question for you, because recently Cultural Survival and First Peoples Worldwide and the Search Coalition published an FPIC guide. And we went to South Africa and met with communities to present this guide. And it was a great experience. And I think this is part also of the work that many Indigenous leaders are doing all over the world to try and uplift self-determination. So can you tell us how this guide is different from other guides? Because other guides have been published as well. And at the same time, what is the coalition trying to do by publishing this guide? Maybe if somebody from our team can bring a guide for us, and this is also on our website for anybody to see, and here's the Spanish version. You can see it there, Galina.
Thank you. I would like to share this response with Kate, since Cultural Survival has partnered with First Peoples Worldwide to produce this guide. It's labor of love by our team members and many other Indigenous leaders who have dedicated many hours coming up with the best version of what we could offer to our sisters and brothers globally. So it's a step-by-step guide for Indigenous leaders in their communities to come up with their own FPIC protocol. And I think this is a guide which is one of its kind, which provides very simple way and direct, straightforward way for communities to make their FPIC protocol a reality. Because sometimes I've seen many FPIC guidelines or protocols, I would say, developed by various institutions and agencies, bilaterals, UN. I think there's the one UN Red Protocol. But they use the legalistic language, which sometimes is not very available for community members. And I think this is not a simple guide. It's not easy reading, but it's accessible, and that's what's important, that we're working with communities first and foremost. And if we're providing them with the language with gibberish that it's not clear and concise, we're not doing our job. That's my response, Miki.
Certainly, I can add, this was a wonderful work to put in, and it really came from the fact that in all of our travels, Galina and I saw that some communities know about free, prior, and informed consent. They know that it exists. They know that companies are asking for it, but there's a gap in implementation. And so what we really wanted to do was to try and close that gap in implementation and give Indigenous leaders around the world the tools they need to use their own representative organizations, their own governments, and their own consensus-making procedures to arrive at a place where they can speak with outside entities, whether it's the state or corporations or investors, about FPIC, and that they are ready and able to do so in a fulsome way. So this guide was really, yes, a labor of love to be able to arm Indigenous leaders and fulsome communities as well to implement FPIC.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. So thank you so much. And for anybody who is interested in, we have some copies here, but also if you'd like to access this guide, you can find it on our website, on Cultural Survival's website, and also the Search Coalition's website. Thank you. And so, Galina, to kind of follow up on not only we talked about the work of the coalition in several at several levels. Also, you kind of touched also a base on some of the legislation that we've been engaged with. So, can you please also talk to us about what successes has the Search Coalition had in this engagement at the several levels, and in specifically, if you could talk about the engagement also with automakers. What has been the movement there, and also the several initiatives around the world around transition minerals and other spaces that we may be looking to influence?
Yes, so it's been 4 years, very hard, long years since we started thinking strategically, because we're not here just to make speeches. Our speeches are only a small fraction of what we do, like a tip of the iceberg. A lot of the work that we do is really day-to-day, not very glamorous work of doing the work behind our screens, right? Meeting people. So we have been engaging with the automakers, the industry, the end user industry, so to speak, because we thought that we found the leverage in being able to speak with them through kind of articulating what kind of risk these companies are facing if they're not considering the indigenous people's rights risk. That we have to learn how to speak the language of risk with the businesses. So we were able to get ourselves in the door first through our case with Nornickel. When I mentioned when 21,000 tons of diesel were spilled, we secured negotiations with Tesla. Out of that negotiations, we were able to get an indigenous people's policy as part of their supply code of conduct. Really elated and on the wings of this success, we're like, okay, we need a larger strategy. We need to get in the room with all of the automakers that are producing electric vehicles. And since then, the First Peoples Worldwide were able to even strengthen the existing language and really with inclusion of free, prior, informed consent in that policy. Now we are in conversations with multiple automakers and actually giving them workshops on who indigenous peoples are, what the right to self-determination is, what the right to free, prior, informed consent is, and what kind of risk they're facing if they're not considering indigenous peoples' risk and the social license to operate. So we also engaged, and maybe Kate, you can also kind of talk about it, because since we've been working all together on this, we have engaged with the Sunrise Project on the Lead the Charge campaign, where we assessed all 18 automakers according to different 81 indicators, like environmental indicators, social, human rights indicators, and there's indicators on indigenous people's rights. So out of 18 companies, 2/3 of them scored 0 on indigenous people's rights. So that means we have a long, long way to go. So through that campaign, we've engaged with multiple automakers, including General Motors, Tesla, Mercedes, and so on and so forth. And so we're following up on this work to really make them accountable and include indigenous people's policies in their human rights policies and as part of their supplier code of conduct. And it's been really interesting. I think for the first time, not for the first time for me, but industry-wide, with the end-user industry, they started having conversations with indigenous peoples. I don't think they've ever had conversations with indigenous peoples prior to that. We are on the radar, and not only we're on the radar, we are being seriously considered and considered. Yeah.
Thank you. And this is I think a lot of the points that also Kate can build on. And I'd like before you reply, if you could just introduce yourself and also First Peoples Worldwide. And I would just like to say also Kate Finn is part of the board of Cultural Survival, so we're very honored to have you here. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for hosting the conversation, Brian, and my huge thanks to Cultural Survival for hosting the Indigenous Media Zone, and for all the work that goes into all of these events. It's wonderful to sit up here with you today. I'm Kate Finn. I am a member of the Osage Nation, and I am director of First Peoples Worldwide, and our work is to build bridges between Indigenous peoples and the private sector and to build the business case for free, prior, and informed consent, which is why it was such an honor to work on this FPIC guide to really think about how can we, as our 5 organizations in Surge, thread all of our expertise, all of our experience, and all of the work that we've done to really provide a detailed look at what FPIC can be in communities. So that was a wonderful, wonderful project for us, as our goals as Surge is to catalyze transformative change. And so it was wonderful to sit through and to be able to produce this with everyone.
Thank you. And so my first question, and because for so many of us who are probably working on the ground, and a lot of times it seems so difficult, if not impossible, to actually sit across the table with the people causing harm. And a lot of that work, and you have a lot of experience in that work and the work that First Peoples Worldwide is doing. So I think this would be a really good question. What are really some of those effective tools that Indigenous peoples have to force the private sector, if I could use that word, to force the private sector to uphold Indigenous rights?
Yeah, so I don't think the word is too strong. I think that's why we're here. I think what we are looking for is something new in the economy and something new through this energy transition, right? Like what we want is something different than business as usual. And so what we need are strategies and tactics that really create that change and make a bump in the market so that those who are only looking at the market and only looking at the economy can see how big the world is and how many and what a diverse set of solutions we need. And, one of the things that I really love about this coalition of organizations is that there's a recognition that we need a diversity of strategy. And we need a lot of different ways to put Indigenous peoples on the front face of corporations, of the private sectors and everything else for their consideration. And so, it's just fun to be able to work. And so in my work in First Peoples Worldwide, our goal and our work is shareholder advocacy. So really making sure that the shareholders of companies, that the investors are aware of the impacts to Indigenous peoples of the companies in their portfolios. Because the research that we have done and what we know just from our work is that the shareholders, the investors, that the companies are not incentivized to report what's going on in the ground to those shareholders. There's no incentive for the companies to say what the impact is, what is the water impact, what is the land impact, who are the Indigenous peoples on the ground, how are they being impacted, what does the labor force look like. There's no incentive for disclosure. And so shareholders, when we go into the room with Indigenous leaders and bring Indigenous leaders into the room and we say, hey, look, there's an issue here. There's no consent to this project. These Indigenous leaders will tell you and show you that over 10 years they have said no. And yet the company has continued. And the shareholders are more often than not surprised and asking, well, how did we get here? And so our work is to really, first of all, to show shareholders, to show investors what questions they need to ask of the companies, and then to move the companies in the first place to ask those questions. How do we solicit consent? How do we understand consent? And honestly, how do we design for a situation in which Indigenous peoples say no? How do we accept that no? So our work is really to do that kind of threading to help investors and companies understand their exposure to Indigenous rights risk.
Thank you. And that makes me, I'm very excited about the approach that the coalition is taking, because as a young Indigenous person myself, we are very eager to come into these spaces and bring some real change. But a lot of times either we don't know how to do it, or we use ways that are not as effective. So to be able to see it up close, the work that the coalition is doing, that First Peoples Worldwide is doing, to me, it gives me hope that there are probably some ways that we can actually use to force companies and uphold Indigenous rights. So thank you for sharing, Kate. I think that's so important for us to know and to continue also learning for everyone, for anyone who's interested out there. They can visit your the website of First Peoples Worldwide and learn more. Now, I think this next question, it's also a question that sometimes we ask, but the private sector, they know exactly what they're doing, but maybe they need to hear it again, and so that's why we're here today. And what exactly are they doing wrong? What is the private sector doing wrong? And second to that, what changes do they need to make so that they don't continue the business as usual?
Right. So this business as usual model has been developed over hundreds of years of colonization, right? It's the way that states have run roughshod over Indigenous peoples, taking land, stealing land, breaking treaties. And the private sector has just borrowed that model. And states generally have let them. And that actually points really to the unique and incredible adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, because it was the first document that said, hang on a second, Indigenous peoples have human rights and are entitled to all of the human rights in all of the international mechanisms, and states need to pay attention to these rights in a very particular way. And so that model of Indigenous peoples not being seen, not being asked, and having their lands and territories considered without their decision-making and participation is what we're dealing with, and that is what we are trying to stop. And so that is what the private sector will do until they're incentivized otherwise, I think. And so what we say in Surge is there is an urgent need to implement free, prior, and informed consent, because that is the mechanism that we can use as Indigenous peoples to help the private sector understand, hold on, we need full and fair decision-making and free participation in anything that has to do with Indigenous peoples and their lands, territories, and resources. And of course, FPIC applies to all of the human rights of Indigenous peoples, to cultural property and intellectual property. But in this particular case, it applies to these lands, territories, and resources, and also understanding of economic value and the economic benefits that come from mining. Even when Indigenous peoples have in the past had mines on their territories, allowed mines on their territories, given consent, often the economic benefits of those mines go far elsewhere. They do not stay in the community. And so that is also something that we want to disrupt. So what we are asking from the private sector, what we want to see them do better, is to make sure that there is free, prior, and informed consent for every project that they are contemplating. And the best way to do that, honestly, is way ahead of time. It takes a lot of time to get free, prior, and informed consent, but that is what is needed if we are going to change business as usual, if we are going to do something different. And once we do that, when we have a world where Indigenous peoples are able to give free, prior, and informed consent, then we are a healthier planet, we are a healthier people, and our global community is much more prosperous.
Thank you. And again, maybe something also that I can reinforce to that, and part of the work that the coalition has been doing is a wraparound support. Not just we support them with capacity building, in supporting with their advocacy efforts, but also a lot of these projects have real life consequences for environmental defenders, Indigenous environmental defenders who have literally have to pay with their lives to fight this cause. So I think it's very important that all of these tools can also uplift that work that we're trying to do. So thank you so much. So I have two more questions, but we're going to tie them together so that we have enough time for some questions. So in the work that you've been doing, and maybe you can talk, what are some of the risks then? If they continue this business as usual, and with the work that the Indigenous movement is trying to do to disrupt the business as usual, what are the risks that they are running into by continuing that business as usual? And second to that is, because I'm sure that this is a question in a lot of people's minds, are there any signs that there are changes on their part?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I want to start, mining is an incredibly risky business, and proceeding with the business as usual model is even riskier. And you named the top risk. There are human rights defenders who are dying to protect their lands because the state has not protected their rights, because corporations have no interest in doing so, and because they feel that that is the only way that they can protect their people and their planet and their legacy to their children. And that is incredibly risky. And that is a risk that I think that corporations need to understand, first and foremost. So to me, that is what we are facing. And that is, to me, why there is an urgent need to understand the rights of Indigenous peoples. I understand that the world has placed a lot of urgency on getting the minerals, on getting the mining, on getting to a better climate. And I think we need to do that. We need to, make this planet livable for all of us. But we can't do that and also have human rights defenders dying because we're not able to recognize human rights. So to me, that is the front and center. That is the risk. And then moving into the business side of things, when we talk about business risks, of course, there's so many different kinds of risks. There's the legal risks that happen. There's political risks, operational, social license to operate. There's all these different kinds of risks, and they're playing out in real time. Recently the Cobre copper mine in Panama was shut down after so many years, and it was just shut down because of social resistance to the mine in large part, and it was a legal order to shut the mine down. That's legal risk. Recently, the Phoenix nickel mine in Guatemala was closed down because of a court order from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights that was based in large part on the fact that the mine, the state, Guatemala, and the mine didn't get proper consultation from the Quechua people who were most affected by the mine. Those are real risks. But the fact of non-consent was telegraphed far earlier than now. So had the companies listened, had the state listened, then they would not have gotten so far and capitalized their investment and also spent billions of dollars. That will cost those companies billions of dollars because they failed to get consent in the first instance. And so these risks are playing out in real time, and I think that it is high time for companies to understand that those risks are real, that they are material, and that they are human. And so that is a huge and very real risk now. And to move to the more hopeful part of the conversation, are there companies that are doing things differently? How are we going to create change? I think Galina said it earlier, and Pyle has been a part of this for many years as well, but there are end user companies now in different kinds of green technologies, whether it be the automotive industry and electric vehicles, renewables, whatever it is, who really have never contemplated before or had to contemplate Indigenous peoples and human rights, and they're ready. They're ready to have really high-level policies. They're ready to understand, okay, what does it mean to ask for FPIC down the supply chain? What does that mean? They're asking us all the time, what do we do? How do we get there? And so there is real hope to me in these end-user companies holding the mining sector and holding the value chain accountable for how FPIC is happening. And so to me, that is really hopeful. And in other parts of our work at First Peoples, I've seen even the insurance industry move to understand, what does it mean if we underwrite a project that doesn't have consent? The answer is nothing good, but they're starting to ask those questions, right? Like where can we insure, where can we not insure? So I think there's real movement by a lot of companies to get to the highest level very quickly.
Thank you so much. And as a final question, because we're getting to the end of our session, I'd like to pose a question for the both of you, because I think it's also a very important question to answer is, what does actual and effective self-determination, the implementation of self-determination, because this year's theme for the forum is self-determination and Indigenous youth. But speaking about self-determination, what does it actually look like for Indigenous peoples? And second to that, and for the three of you, how can also our allies who might be listening to this conversation here in the room or are watching this feed live can support the work of the coalition, please?
So what does this world look like with self-determination? It looks like there are Indigenous leaders in every room where decisions are being made, right? It looks like Indigenous leaders are able to implement every single aspect of the UNDRIP without challenge. And it looks like we can speak our languages and we can do so freely. And if I can tell a little bit of a story, a big part of our work at First Peoples Worldwide has been to challenge racist logos in professional sports. And in 2020, we saw one of the big racist logos fall. We were able to get the team to change that logo, which is huge to me because it meant that over 2,000 high schools also changed their racist logos, which meant that there's Native kids that just get to play baseball without terrible imagery surrounding them. So to me, self-determination is when Native kids get to play sports and get to, speak their language and be part of their drum dances without fear, without repercussion, and in just kind of freely enjoying their identities. So to me, self-determination is really something that we all work for together, and something that I really look forward to our children and grandchildren getting to do and be and not have to think about. They just get to be themselves. So that's, to me, a big part of that. And to answer your second question, we couldn't have had that win with the logo without so many allies. There were so many people for over 30 years working hard to build support and to help the different companies understand why the logo was racist and what it means to Indigenous peoples, and to run market studies on that kind of imagery. And so all of this work takes all of us. And in this coalition together, we work very strongly to put the voices of Indigenous peoples on all of our shoulders, so that as we're all doing our work and working in our various places, we can hear those words and take that into our work. And we do that all together as a coalition.
So, according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, self-determination and the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine their priorities. Cultural priorities, political, social, and any other priorities that they have. But what does that mean on the ground? Yeah, what does it really mean in communities? To me, first and foremost, it's the decision-making ability of communities. If a project or any developer comes to the land of Indigenous peoples, for them to decide what works for that specific community. The ability to be consulted, the ability to provide ample information way before the decision is made about that project, right? Fully informed. And that really constitutes a right to free, prior, and informed consent, because we do believe that the right to free, prior, and informed consent is our vehicle or a car. It's a metaphor that what we use, that leads us, that gets us to the ultimate goal, to our North Star of self-determination. That's it. We collectively, because in a lot of Indigenous communities, it's our collective decision-making, right? That we can decide what works for us. That's what it means on the ground. It can be a yes, it can be a no, it can be a maybe, it can be a yes with condition, but it's the people who live in the land have that right to make that decision. How do the general public support the Search Coalition? Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. That's the easiest thing you can do. You can put a like, a follow, read. We have put out a lot of material, case studies, articles. Everything is up there. You can get yourself educated about the impacts that Indigenous peoples are currently facing with the green transition and digital transition. This morning I had a conversation with an elder, with the traditional elder from Siberia. And that kind of support, that she instructed me how to be in this space, how to come to this space, the way I should walk in this space. And that's invaluable. To me, that's also support that comes from our elders, that comes from our traditional knowledge holders. This is probably the most important support, that we get that wind of help that puts us to do this work and move us forward.
Thank you. Bio. How can everyone support the coalition?
Well, I think what Galina just said is really important. And I think also just, using every opportunity that we have to provide this form of education about the materials that we use. They do come from somewhere, and they come from the lands of people who have already had so many of their, rights trampled and been disenfranchised of those rights. We need to, once again, make sure that Indigenous peoples are front and center and making their own determination, self-determination about their lands, about their territories, and we cannot consider this to be sort of an out of sight, out of mind issue. So for people who are in the places where the consumption is happening, where the decisions are being made, you can vote with your wallet, and you can make sure that you're sharing those concerns with the companies that you're buying from, or you're invested in, or your school is invested in, or your company is invested in, or your retirement funds are invested in. And I also wanted to add to Galina's really important point about our elders, is also just how inspiring it is to hear from our youth and people like Brian and others who are here, who are really carrying this difficult work forward. And those in communities as well.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we will not have time for questions because we're almost at the end of our session. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. And I would just like to take the time, this last few minutes that we have, to remind everyone, and this is an open invitation for Indigenous youth, that Cultural Survival, First Peoples Worldwide, and the Search Coalition are organizing a workshop, and it is titled Empowering Indigenous Youth in the Energy Transition, where we will be discussing in details all of these issues around transition minerals and some of the effective tools that we can use to force corporations to uphold our rights. So if you can share this information, attend this event as Indigenous youth, you are welcome. This is going to take place on the 18th. You can check on the 18th in the afternoon, and you can check our website for the details on the address and exact time. So please come and join the conversation. Again, I also want to thank Cultural Survival for hosting this space. And to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, also come and join us in these spaces. And I know a lot of times it feels like our stories may be lost in a sea of voices that come here every year, but we want to listen to your stories. Your stories are valuable, and we want to listen to all of it. Thank you so much for joining this conversation and for our speakers for this rich conversation. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you.